Hey, everybody. Trish Wood here with a few notes for you before the show. I just got back from the cottage after 9 days where I said I wasn't going to work, but I did work a little because I have begun a special project, which I want to tell you about. And then I have a couple of announcements also, and then we'll just go into the regular show, which I recorded for you just before I went away. So I hadn't intended on doing this, but you know me, I can't stay away from the microphone and you and projects. So the first one is, you may or may not know that we are working with Tamara Leach on a film ostensibly called The Trials of Tamara Leach. It's a profile, a biopic, a biodocumentary of her. As you know, she's always has fascinated me really since day one, how she kept it together under some extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Obviously, it is not going to be a hagiography because we don't do hagiographies, but I do admire her. And most people who embark on documentary biopics do it because they think the person they're profiling is something special. And she is. And both she and Chris Barber, who we also interviewed out west last week, not me, but my producing partner, Jacqueline Bynan, they gave extraordinary interviews about what they're facing this week coming up in Ottawa at the criminal trials, facing the charges that were leveled against them when the Prime Minister cracked down with the Emergencies Act on the Freedom Convoy, the trucker convoy in Ottawa. What a dark day that was. And, you know, for me, the darkness also comes because we have a Give, Send, Go up to support the film. This is an independent film that my producer friend and I are subsidizing out of our own pocketbooks, maxing out the credit cards, et cetera, to get it done. We had to do that quite quickly because when we finally got everything together to start filming, we only had a couple of weeks before they were heading out to Ottawa, and we wanted to capture them at home with their families and friends before they went out to face the music in Ottawa. So we have done a Give, Send, Go, and we are asking for your support. We'd be so very grateful for it to try to tell this story in a bit of a different way. There's another good documentary out called Unacceptable, which you should also watch, but I think there's lots of room to do documentaries about the Freedom Convoy, definitely the most important protest in Canadian history, wasn't it? So there's lots of room for people to do good work. And they did a fantastic one. And now we're doing a little bit of a different take through the eyes of Tamara. And I hope that you will support our project if you can afford it. I'm seeing a lot of wealthy people crowdfunding stuff these days. And I'm thinking, wow, you know, this is a new thing. But listen, I'm not wealthy. As I say on the show all the time, I'm wealthy adjacent. I live in a really good neighborhood and I have no money. So we would be very grateful if you would, if you can, step up to support our film called The Trials of Tamara Leach. You will find the link to the Give, Send, Go on my website for the show, which is trishwoodpodcast.com. And you could also, if you don't want to use Give, Send, Go, and some people don't, you can send through an email money transfer to trishwoodeditorial@gmail.com. We'll take that too. And I will also post a P.O. box on the website if you want to mail a check, if you can afford it only. Please. So I thought you'd like to hear our trailer. It's not very long, and it consists just of what we've shot so far, which were some deep interviews with Tamara about what she's facing in Ottawa next week. So let's listen to the trailer.
It's not an illegal protest. It's in our...
Is the trailer for our film, The Trials of Tamara Leach. And the last line she said in that clip was, "This is my hill," meaning this is my hill to die on. And I will tell you, she's resolute. We don't know what's going to happen next week, do we? I'm going down there on a Sunday of this week. I'm going to stay for a few days. We are going to film a little bit, and I'm going to watch the trial a little bit. And we're going to be covering the trial on this podcast regularly, so we can see what happens. With any luck, they will drop the charges at some point. It would seem that the Public Order Emergencies Commission showed that they really don't have a prosecutorial leg to stand on. That's my opinion. I'm entitled to it, I think, in this country still. And regardless of what happens judicially for Tamara, she is a hell of a story, and she's a hell of a Canadian. And so that's the film. Give, Send, Go on my website. And thanks for your consideration on that. I have two more things I want to plug, if you don't mind. The Free Speech in Medicine Conference is coming up again in beautiful Bedeque, Nova Scotia. I was there last year, and it was one of the highlights of my life. I got to meet Jay Bhattacharya for the first time. I mean, I felt like I knew him, right? I've done so many interviews with him. And of course, we were maybe the first podcast, if not the first, then the second, to interview about the Great Barrington Declaration, and with Martin and Jay, and became pretty friendly. And I learned in Bedeque that he is as lovely in person as he is, on in the digital life on the podcast. So it's a wonderful thing to do if you can afford it. It's not cheap. I think it's like $600, but it's 2 nights hotel and some wonderful people. Let me just tell you who is going to be there. The one and only Gad Sad, Dr. Aaron Cariati, who I don't know that well. I've interviewed him a couple of times, but he's extraordinary. Ian McGilchrist, who is a legend, and was the focus of a film by a friend of mine named Vanessa Dillon, and the film was called The Divided Brain. He's a huge, huge dude. It's amazing they got him, actually. And many others, Rupa, the one and only Rupa Subramanya, who's a journalist and a friend, Lisa Bildy, who's a great and dedicated lawyer, lots of cool people. So if you can get out there, do it. It's the chance of a lifetime, and you will be around some amazing, amazing people. And then the other project that I just want to bring your attention to is called the Canary in a COVID World. And it's a very interesting book project. I made a contribution to it. I was asked to do so by the editor, and many, many wonderful people, way better than me, are involved in it too, who've put in chapters about censorship and deceit during the COVID times. Here we are having this incredibly intense public health crisis, however you view that. And information is ungettable. You've got to fight for every scrap of truth, and finding it is hard. And the people delivering it are being pilloried by legacy media and the health bureaucrats. I mean, it was just I can't believe we all survived it, people. I really can't, but we did. And here we are. And there's a really great book about it. And I was asked to contribute a chapter, and I did. And it's called A Cruel Season, I believe, because as you know, what I focused on in the show very much is the unimaginable cruelty behind much of what they did. And they weren't doing risk-benefit ratios. They weren't saying, well, if we lock down, it might save 5 people, but it will kill 10 people through suicide and addiction. They didn't do that. That calculation was never made. And I never understood it. And I will say to you that it was that more than any other element of this, well, and the pushing of fear, that has completely turned me off the health bureaucracy. And I will say, actually, medicine in general. Right? You don't take untried, untested measures without calculating what the downside might be. But they didn't. Anyway, that's what I write about in this book, Canary in a COVID World. You can get it on Amazon. And I think you'll like it. There's some wonderful people, very, very big name people writing in this book. So consider that if you need something to read this fall as you're cozying up in front of the fire as the temperatures drop. Anyway, that's me checking in. 3 things: the film, The Trials of Tamara Leach, the Free Speech and Medicine Conference in October in Bedeque, Nova Scotia. They have a website. It's easy to find. And Canary in a COVID World on Amazon. So here we go. Here's the show. Here's my normal sting music. And do understand this was recorded like almost 2 weeks ago. So there's probably a lot of stuff happening in the media that normally I would talk about, but I don't in this show. But having said that, I hope you like it anyway. And I'll advise you to stay critical, and I'll see you soon from Ottawa.
I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla.
You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You're there once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here. And this is show number 2 recorded in advance because I'm down at the cottage on Lake Erie. What that means from a practical sense is that I'm not going to be commenting on super current events like things that happened the week that you're listening to this. And that's because I recorded this, quite a few days ago so that I could go on a 9-day holiday. Today, our guest is someone I admire greatly. His name is Sohrab Ahmari, and he is the founder and editor of something called Compact Magazine, COMPACT. It's one of these publications that I think you people should be taking a look at. I recommend things from time to time, like County Highway, various Substacks. I'm very fond of all kinds of internet magazines, but you have to kind of seek them out, right? And I do, as I said to Walter Kern, I do print things off. I don't read things on a computer screen. I have to print them off, which drives my husband nuts because it's quite expensive to do that, what with paper and ink and everything. But I do that. The Compact Magazine, which is edited by Sohrab Ahmari, is a very interesting, it's kind of conservative, but very, very thoughtful. It's not conservative in the sense that you can predict what the writers are going to be talking about. It's kind of like Tablet. I also really, really like Tablet. They've done some brilliant work. And it's really worth checking in on and subscribing to if you can afford it with all the people you've subscribed to now, but it's really worth it because they're kind of conservative in their view, but they're not married to ideology. That's what we need in our lives right now, don't we? Is free thinking people who are kind of critically making their way through a very, very difficult time. So Sohrab Ahmari's book, Tyranny Inc, is really worth taking a look at. And maybe it's something for your end of season reading if you've still got a little bit of time on holiday or up at your cottage to spend a weekend reading a book. It might be this one. It's quite good. One of the things we did last week was play some TikTok and YouTube little moments of people who were so fed up with this country, with Canada, and in many cases, specifically Ontario, that they were frustrated enough to post their innermost thoughts on the internet. And some of them are leaving. As I said last week, a favorite cameraman of mine is leaving the country and going back to Kenya because it's so hard to live here. And it's not just the money. There is an oppressiveness about the government here that I think we're all feeling. And let me just say this to you. You know that I interview a lot of people around the world, all pretty critically thinking people, not super reactionary or anything. And to a person, they express concern and sympathy for people living in this country, right? And I think the main thing that freaked them out, beyond the fact that our prime minister is a lightweight who does not have the intellectual chops to be running a country. He just doesn't have the depth, the experience, the humanity, nothing. He's a narcissist. He's a drama teacher. And the fact that he was elected, it says something kind of dark about us, that because some people think he's good looking, I think he's hideous. You could ugh. But some people do. And I guess he has some kind of theatrical charisma. So that's who gets voted in. We got to stop doing that. We have to vote for ugly people who are smart. I mean, they don't have to be ugly, but if an ugly person is smart and critically thinking and concerned about the electorate instead of themselves, and WEF and all the fools over at Davos and the other kind of globalist institutions, that's who we have to go with. Why did we end up with this guy? It's really a tragedy for this country. It's ruining this country, actually. And the people who follow him, I see them on Twitter, they can't defend him in any rational way. It's like I saw a kind of a well-to-do, democratically voting couple interviewed by one of those street interviewers in America, and they were talking about Biden. They couldn't give a single sane reason why they voted for Biden, but my God, Biden was their man. Corrupt, demented, destroying the country, arrogant, dishonest, attacking his political enemies with lawfare. How do you possibly defend voting for this guy or continuing to vote for him? I don't get it. And Justin Trudeau is the same. I don't think he's going to survive much longer. I think that his announcement of his rift with, we all knew they were not living together anyway. That's not a big secret. But the announcement of his divorce from Sophie Gregoire, his wife, may have been a kind of a cleanup on aisle 3, perhaps before some dirt comes out or something else that he's got to make this move now. But I don't think he'll be around to, and I won't even use the word govern. He's not governing us. He's dividing us for his friends in the globalist community. He wants to keep us fighting with each other, right? This is kind of where we are right now. We're in a place where people are putting TikToks and YouTubes and other little personal commentaries on, talking about how awful it is to be here. And why are they doing it? They're doing it because the politicians aren't listening. If you're pouring your heart out as a citizen on digital media and social media, you're doing it because the politicians aren't hearing us. And that is absolutely true. They get voted in and then they go and do whatever they want. Here in Toronto, they were going to spend $8 million to change the name of Dundas Street to something else because somebody complained about it. Some colonialist history or something. $8 million. $8 million. I mean, this city is just, it's madness. So here are two of the clips I wanted to hear from you. We started this last week and I wanted to play 2 more this week for you.
I want to know how the hell people in Canada are even living. I generally consider myself a positive person. I'm resourceful, but some stuff happened around the property and well, I know I'll never truly be homeless. I have family to live with. And, I have options. I'm luckier than a lot of other people. But how the hell is anyone existing in Canada? I feel trapped. And, I just got a good job. I started in September. But even with that job, it pays less than 40 grand a year. And it's a job that requires, education and even on that job, I still can't do shit. I can't buy anything. I can't afford the rent these days. I'm just feeling so much despair. And I know I'm normally, really, really positive, but I'm just, how is everyone else? And are you okay? Because the answer's probably no. And I know I'm lucky. I don't have kids. I have good family that will support me, but I feel like I can't stay here, but I can't move anywhere else.
I'm having a day. Or I'm having a life. I don't know, man. I just don't know what to do anymore. I'm sitting outside work, crying my eyes out in my vehicle. Because I can't function anymore. Financially, I don't understand anymore. I don't understand how I make $34 an hour and I can't function. I can't function. I can't pay my bills. I can't even literally keep gas in my car to get to work 3 days a week because I can't afford it. I get paid and it goes to car, mortgage, a couple little bills, and then maybe $80 in food for the week. And I literally only buy groceries when my daughter's home now. On the weeks that she goes with her dad, which is Monday to Monday, what I've started doing is I buy a loaf of rye bread and I work really hard to keep that one loaf of rye bread lasting me the whole week. And I eat peanut butter. So I'll eat peanut butter toast whenever I'm hungry. And it's been fine. It's been working just fine. I'm good with that. That's fine. But last week, I guess I was a little extra hungry a couple days, so I had toast in the morning and toast in the evening, which That's not in my budget. So I ran out of bread on like the Thursday or even the Friday, I don't know. Either way, at 47, I had to see if my mother could buy me a loaf of bread so that I could eat for the weekend before my daughter got home. Because if there's any food in the house, I'm not fucking eating one bit of it. I'm saving everything I can for her. Because then she gets home and she's not surviving off fucking toast. I don't give a shit. I don't give a shit. I don't understand why things are so hard right now. I apparently make too much money to receive any financial benefits or help of any kind. I don't get GST. I don't get like the grocery benefit for single parents, even though I'm a single parent, but I apparently make too much money. I can't reach out to certain resources or any resources because I make too much money. You're going to die when I tell you what I pay for a mortgage right now. $400 every 2 weeks. And I'm dying. I have to renew my mortgage for February. And I already know that my mortgage will be less, but my payments are going to be probably $400 more a month. I don't know how to budget that in. I don't know what to do. I'm trying to sell stuff on Marketplace. I'm trying to find stuff for a yard sale. You know, I feel like I take one step forward and 8 steps back. Like, I get pushed back 8 steps. Not that I take one step back. I'm just being forced to go back.
Shame on our political leaders who drove us into massive economic turmoil over the virus without a plan on how to get out of the crisis later. They didn't do that. And people like the woman we just heard, they're carrying this. And it's, you know, you wonder why suicides and deaths of despair and addiction and all kinds of stuff is off the charts right now. That's why people can't live in this country. It's an embarrassment. This country is an embarrassment right now. And please stop voting for the Liberals. Stop it. And don't just vote for who isn't liberal. We got to get the good people in there. We need good people in there who care about us and know what they're doing. Because what COVID showed us is that we are governed by inept fools who don't know how to run things and who don't have our best interests at heart. That's what I would say about that. I'm upset about it. It's terrible to hear someone in that situation. Anyway, as I said, you are going to hear from a brilliant essayist and writer, Sohrab Ahmari from Compact Magazine, and he's going to be talking about Tyranny Inc., which connects to this because it is about how these huge corporations are now corrupt. And he's not a lefty. So, you know, we're all mad at them now because of the way they've been behaving. So here's my interview with Sohrab. Hi, Sohrab. How are you?
Thank you for having me, Trish.
Very happy to have you on. So I got through much of your book last night, Tyranny Inc., and I think it's a really, really interesting take on ideas that we've been touching on here and there over the past couple of years on the show. But usually when we're looking at, I guess corporate America is the best phrase to use it, though we're doing more of a kind of a Vivek Ramaswamy ESG as the devil, you know, to beat all devils kind of thing. But you have a more interesting take on that. And I think a more historical take, actually, because you suggest that the problem of coercion in our culture driven by this system began, I think you said about 10 years ago. They were warning of democratic recession, which is a great word with no sign of a turnaround. So explain, I guess I don't want to be too kind of general, but I guess if you could just start by explaining the premise of the book so people fully understand what we're doing here.
Absolutely. So Tyranny Inc. is about the fact we are surrounded by coercion in our market lives, in our lives as employees and consumers. That the private sector is in fact a place where we are routinely coerced, and precisely because we're used to thinking of these sharp barriers between private and public, what happens to us in the private sector, for example, when we're subjected to pervasive surveillance by our employers as part of the employment agreement, we're used to thinking of that as a private issue and therefore not something that we can challenge democratically the way we challenged coercion if government does to us. And there's a kind of prevailing American mentality that coercion is only what government does to us. And of course, we should be alert to government coercion, and our constitutional system is actually pretty robust when it works in terms of ameliorating government coercion or blocking it outright. But we have become vulnerable, especially I would say in recent decades, over the past 2 generations, to this kind of hyper privatizing mentality, which has strengthened the hands of a relatively few corporate actors and Wall Street relative to, everyone else. And that's the premise of the book.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And they're not even really trying to hide it anymore. It's quite, they're the people who, if I could just bring it back to COVID, which we talk about a lot on the show, because it was such, aside from the medical side of it, which was kind of a disaster, but culturally and democratically, it was also a nightmare for us all. I believe it opened the door, but for what you're talking about, so we can see it better. But there certainly were people who, because in a sense of coercion by the government toward the citizenry around certain public health policy edicts, there were a lot of people in this select group you talk about who did very, very, very well, didn't they?
Yeah, of course. And that's the thing with private coercion, is that it often rests on government power. In other words, it's the government, first of all, that creates the market. The market is not some natural thing that grows on trees. Market societies are the result of a complex set of, of laws, of administrative diktats, of, frankly, in the American and broader Western context, markets were kind of a trauma for ordinary people who had been used to more communitarian yeoman farmer type setting in which like one patriarch could sustain a family. And then the market comes in the late 18th, 19th century with ferocious force, and it's often using the power of law to transform our lives so that we're used to kind of market imperatives. Not all of it is bad, to be clear, but we just have to recognize the market is not in fact, much of it is good and, creates efficiency, creates products that we need and improve our lives. But this illusion that the market is sort of this organic thing that's natural is just that. It's an illusion. And so in the case of COVID, for example, it wasn't just the government saying you should do X, Y, Z, and Americans, of course, disagreed. Reasonable Americans disagreed ferociously about those measures. But the fact that the government designated arbitrarily certain enterprises as essential enterprises and others as, I guess, not essential led to, a lot of small businesses being forced to close so that the only place ordinary Americans could get their basic goods for living was to turn to, Amazon and Jeff Bezos, who, and others like that, who enormously increased their total wealth, at the expense of other kinds of smaller businesses that are relatively less powerful.
Yeah. And they're not, when I say they're not trying to hide it, I mean, Jeff Bezos just took delivery of this $500 million, I think the largest sailing vessel in the world. And I say this almost on every show, but I don't want to let a show pass without saying it, that on the prow of this boat is a wooden carving of his pneumatically enhanced now fiance. I mean, it is the ultimate decadent kind of FU money flash, right? and the reason that's important is because the struggle on our end, the middle class struggling, the sort of below middle class, everybody's struggling. So for this guy who profited off of A, coercion, and B, cruelty and heartbreak to be sailing around Europe in this boat with the girl, that the fiance is just, it's kind of, for me, a real microcosm of where we are right now.
Oh, absolutely. But, one thing I try to do, the book's introduction begins with these really striking cases that are well known, including one involving Amazon, where a worker who was trying to start a labor union in his at Amazon, he was working on JFK 8, which is a Amazon warehouse facility on Staten Island in New York. He was fired including for objecting to Amazon's COVID policies at the time. We didn't know how to mitigate COVID, and so it was demanding ever longer hours from workers, even as they were getting sick. I present the story, and I kind of pretend at first that this took place in China. So I change all the names and
it's clever.
The places and the characters, so that when you read it, you're like, oh yeah, this is the kind of thing that the authoritarian Chinese regime would do. And then later I reveal, no, actually that took place on Staten Island. Yeah. And so there are these very visible cases, but much of the book is devoted to less visible instances of similar kinds of workplace coercion. There's not a little irony in the fact that workplace organizer, Christian Smalls, is African American, by the way, and Amazon's internal general counsel described him as not smart or articulate. And this was just when Amazon in public was pushing itself to the forefront of the kind of George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter, et cetera. But it shows you how cynical wokeism can be. That is, it's just a kind of public facing advertising. And then meanwhile, behind the scenes, they're, as greedy as any other large company. Anyway, so the point is, much of the book, though, isn't about these instances which we're all familiar with, like the censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story by Twitter and Facebook. I was the op editor of the New York Post when that happened, so I was sort of at the center of that storm. Yeah. Yes, and wow. But we all know that, but less, much of the book is devoted to these kind of less visible forms of coercion that are no less insidious. So, for example, just to give one example. There's something called private arbitration or commercial arbitration. It's how, for a very long time, merchants of relatively equal bargaining power resolve their disputes. You agree to say, if a dispute arises between these two merchants, we agree not to go to a traditional courtroom. Why? Because traditional courts are expensive and they're bitter and litigation is difficult. So we agree to have a neutral mediator resolve our disputes. And that's perfectly fine when you have merchants of relatively equal bargaining power. But in recent years, that model of arbitration has been steadily expanded to the workplace in a situation of vast power disparities between the lone employee and typically the much larger employer. So, for example, there was a gentleman named Stephen Morris who worked as a low-level accountant at Ernst & Young, the global accounting. And he had a wage dispute where he was a low-level employee and therefore under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is a New Deal era law that guarantees you overtime in the workplace, he was entitled to overtime. And the Fair Labor Standards Act specifically is meant to encourage workers to act collectively when it comes to issues like this in the private economy. Why? Because if they go up individually, they can't win. In other words, it's not even rational for them to do so. He wanted to recover like $4,000 in unpaid wages. It would only make sense to band together with other similarly situated workers. But Ernst & Young insisted that he go through an arbitration process that would have cost $200,000. Wow. And our court system says, yes, your employer can bind you to arbitration. So it's this kind of, in other words, ultimately just denying him a right that would otherwise be guaranteed to him under federal law. So it's this kind of less visible coercion that's really at the meat of the book.
So I just want to ask you a question about this because obviously you're conservative in your political view, I'm assuming, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. And conservatives, and I sort of count myself as one, I'm still not fully in. I've had a long winding road of
we all do.
Right, of enlightenment. Because I get so mad at some things in each position, right?
Yes. I'm just like that.
Yeah. It's really hard to exist right now. But the defense of kind of, to use a cliche, unfettered capitalism, right, or unfettered markets has always been, or unless I'm wrong about that, or has until recently been really the purview of people on the conservative side of the political equation, right? And it's only now with people like you and Vivek and others who are saying something's gone wrong here, you know, my question to you about what's gone wrong is it because, in your view, human nature is always dark and will always win out if there is currency or exchanges somehow involved? Remember, there was a documentary called The Corporation that accused corporations of being psychopathic by nature. And I'm just wondering how we got here now that, you know, learned people like you and Vivek and others are really, you know, Tucker Carlson are really crapping on the business world right now.
So that's a big question and lots to unpack there. The first thing I would say is that defense of markets over everything and pretending like, you know, the market will take care of every problem that it itself generates is not really a conservative position. That's really a laissez-faire or libertarian position.
Yeah.
The American tradition, you know, has this long history of conservatives who are not conservatives, but just revered traditional American figures who were, you know, worried about elements of the market. So, for example, you know, Thomas Jefferson believed that, you know, in order to have a self-governing republic, you need, you know, a modestly propertied citizenry. And so he said, and I quote, that government should make every effort to ensure that as few people as possible are without a little bit of land.
Yeah.
Slightly. And so that what that implies is if you have very unequal distribution of power between, you know, social classes, and that means unequal distribution of assets, that could threaten self-government and a Republican self-government. I say small r Republican self-government. Why? Because first of all, people who don't have that level of kind of at least a sort of modest investment in the economic system, they don't trust the economic system and they don't trust the society overall. They're alienated. Likewise, I mean, a lot of other founding fathers, like John Dickinson and others, were constantly worried that you would get an industrial economy, urban industrial economy that would just involve vast disparities between a relatively few very powerful people and a dispossessed mass of other people. And unfortunately, in some ways, in the 19th century, that is how the American economy unfolded. But then, you know, through the 20th century, we set up certain reforms, especially, you know, the New Deal, which tried to sort of ameliorate that vast disparity in power. And lots of conservatives, like President Eisenhower or President Nixon, actually upheld those reforms. They saw its necessity. Why? Because they had lived through the sort of the crises of the early 20th century. So this model of markets über alles, you know, just pure libertarianism is really a relatively new thing in the American tradition and even on the American right. There was always tensions and discomfort with it. And so, you know, now it's, you know, we're coming to a point where things are changing again, as you noted. One factor is that the Republican Party, especially because of the figure of Donald Trump, is increasingly a working class party. That is the people who catapulted Trump to the Oval Office in 2016. You know, there was lots of people, but the ones who were really decisive in states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania were union households. He won the highest share of union households of any Republican nominee since Ronald Reagan in 1984. And so that tells you that, you know, the base of the two parties are somewhat shifting in terms of who their base is. And, you know, we're all becoming a little bit more aware of the ways in which, you know, unhindered markets led to the, you know, devastation of the heartland, the loss of good, you know, unionized factory jobs with stability and decent healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. And so just to answer, I'll stop because I know I give a long digressive answer.
No, it's a great answer. It's a great answer. Thank you.
But just to answer your point about my larger philosophical frame on this, you know, I'm a I'm a Catholic. We can get into why. I'm a Catholic convert. But Catholicism doesn't have this idea that human beings are just radically and inherently evil. It recognizes us as kind of rational, political animals who are also kind of wounded by the fall. And so it doesn't say, well, all government is just a response to our utter depravity. It rather says human beings are naturally political and social, and we all yearn for the good. It just recognizes that because of the fall, because of our brokenness, there's, in order for our institutions to work well, we actually need government. In other words, Catholicism, as a presence in the American conservative movement and more broadly globally, has never been this kind of more libertarian tendency of everything that humans do is evil, et cetera, et cetera. Rather, it says, look, markets can be good, government can be good. They can also be bad because we're fallen creatures, and therefore we need to sort of work together and strive for the common good. So it's a more complex view of things. Therefore, you don't say immediately all government is bad, which is a kind of libertarian position. Nor do you say all markets must be evil, which is a more kind of socialist position. It creates a more kind of mixed view that happens to be how America and especially in the mid 20th century, in the aftermath of World War II, was this kind of a recognition that markets do some things right, but also hey, there are other areas where markets can fail us, and if we just leave it up to the imperatives of the asset owning few in society, well, it'll work out very well for them, but not for others. So we need to sort of balance that and have a balanced society. I think that's my overall frame for all this philosophically is, a mixed system is good. And it actually does in some ways jibe with America's founding ideals too, but I've already given too long of an answer.
No,
so
you have. There's no such thing. But I do want to, and I want to pick up the Catholicism thing too, because I have some troubles with my own feelings about faith right now as a result of COVID and other things. I'd like to get your opinion on a couple of them. But before we go there, I just want to also mention an observation of my own and then have you comment. And that is that you talk a lot about coercion. You have this great phrase about how the asset less, are being abused by the asset rich, which is totally true. Never more so, in my view, than during and post-COVID. But I feel this coercion now corporately in many, many spheres of my life that I didn't feel before. And I'm old enough to remember when companies and corporations at least pretended to care about their consumers. There was some nobility about it. And I, in the olden days, would call up the head of Bell Canada if I was mad about something. I'd get his number and call him on a landline. I usually wouldn't get him. I'd get his EA and I explained the problem and it'd be fixed in a day. Like there was a real sense that there was responsibility in what they were doing. I feel now that is gone. We see it in the airline industry. I see it in retail shopping where there's signs up saying, don't be rude to our staff. And when we're the ones who are being treated badly, like I feel sort of like all bets are off right now. And corporations, especially ones that deal directly with the public, are showing the ugly face of having gained some kind of new power in this dynamic in which we live now. Do you understand? Like, I don't know if it's created by online. I don't know where it comes from, but it's for sure it's true. And I don't know where it's coming from, but there's been a power shift. The customer is now always wrong, apparently.
Yes, so I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I experience it daily. I think we all do. Where first of all, every interaction is somehow harder, and you're often dealing with some machine that doesn't understand what you're saying, and you can never reach a human person.
Never.
That's one.
Never.
Etc. So I think the root of this, not to go all wonky, is just that we have been falsely sold. We've been sold a bad bill of goods, which is that everything in the economy is a question of supply and demand. So like the wages of workers and how consumers are treated is just has to do with how supply and demand work. And ultimately what will regulate all this is the price point, right? Price is this magical crystallization of where supply and demand meet each other. And because there is competition among many sellers for any good, any product or any good, therefore no single one of these entities could oppress us because there's always competition and you can always find a better deal elsewhere. Whether that's you as a consumer, you can go to someone else, or whether you as a worker, you can get a job elsewhere. So unfortunately, this is basically a view of the economy that was kind of true in the late 18th century when you had mostly kind of a whole bunch of yeoman farmers, you had independent artisans and mechanics, and there were lots of them, and they could each deal with each other at arm's length. And if they didn't like the price, they could go elsewhere. And so this kind of Arcadia, this utopia emerged. In reality, ever since really kind of the mid to late 19th century, we have an economy in which there are very few sellers in each market. It's called an oligopoly. It's not the same as a monopoly. Everyone, including libertarians, agrees that monopolies are bad. That's when there's just one seller and they can basically tell workers, consumers, everyone, they can tell whatever they want and it's their way or the highway.
Yeah.
It's not quite that, but it's an oligopoly. What an oligopoly means is one in a market in which there's just a few, like two or three sellers. So, if you think about, for example, retail, you have Amazon, you have Walmart, you have a few others that really dominate the retail. And so you as the consumer, when that situation emerges, you really don't have this, there's no walking away the way there might be in that Arcadia of the late 18th century that's still taught in Econ 101 courses. You're at the mercy of a few sellers who can they can choose to set their price. The price is not nearly as kind of magically competitive as idealized economic theory tells us. When you have a few sellers, price competition goes away. They really can just tell you the price and you're forced to go along. And so we have to recognize that things like price, and that includes the price of labor, which has another word called wages. Price is really just an index of relative bargaining power. So if your bargaining power is low, you get to be told what the price is and you're stuck. There's no other way. And so you get to be treated however the larger entities want to treat you. So how did we solve this somewhat? This was better, as you remember, and I remember, I was born in 1985, so I was born in the aftermath of all this, but there was a time when it was better. And the reason why it was better was because in an earlier age, especially in the, let's say the first 30 years after World War II, government made it its business to try to raise up the power of the people who are subject to these oligopolies, whether as workers or as consumers. So there was government actively promoted, of course, labor unions, which negotiated over the price of wages. It promoted all sorts of electricity co-ops and energy co-ops, which pooled the power of consumers so that they could go up against large energy companies, telecom, etc. In all of these instances, we recognize that the price isn't a magical savior. The price point is actually just an index of power. And so if you want a more decent society, you will have to kind of raise up the other side, which is typically ordinarily weak, and have it sort of balance the other side. Again, we go back to this concept of a more balanced economy. One way to think of a balanced economy is just in which the two sides are a little bit more evenly matched. That's what we achieved in the first 3 decades after World War II. And it's what we've increasingly lost in recent years. And so we feel, you're like, I don't like this. And you again, free market absolutist kind of theory says, well, you can always find a better deal elsewhere, but then you go to the next place and it's the same lousy deal.
Yeah. And that's really interesting because you're sort of talking about market forces, right? But what, if I'm reading it correctly, the corollary to that is that corporations will get away with what they can get away with, right? That there isn't, like, I'm always on the human side. I assume we have a cable company here that does the cable TV for our apartment and also our internet. And they really want everybody to drop the cable TV and watch internet TV, get their internet TV service. And we don't want that because their internet service is so crappy that if we relied on that for watching TV, we could never do that. So here's what they do. They say, we called and we said, the cable running into our apartment is not working. You need to fix it. We're not fixing it. You have to get Ignite TV. That's their response now. They're literally swaggering, right? Like this is the biggest cable TV company in the country, and they're now refusing to fix their infrastructure because they don't want us to have it, because everybody being on this Ignite TV is way cheaper for them from an infrastructure perspective, but it's garbage because their internet service in this building is terrible. And I'm like, who would do this? Like, who is the man in the boardroom who said, screw Trish Wood? We are not, we don't care about what happens to her or honoring a contract, which is that they provide us with cable television. I mean, it was the boldness. I wish I'd been rolling a tape on it, because the boldness of the conversation was essentially our way or the highway. And if you don't like it, tough. I mean, it was shocking.
So this is like a classic case of what I characterize in the title of my book as Tyranny Incorporated. And it's a classic case of the failure of the idea of price competition and just competition in general being the sort of panacea this is not live, right?
No, we can fix something.
Okay. So of price, this is a classic case of competition in general not being a panacea against oppression in our private economy. That is, your cable company more or less has no competition. Right. Or has very minimal competition.
Yeah.
So it can tell you more or less, like, I'm not going to repair. You're going to have to upgrade this other service that you don't really want. And, again, a certain kind of libertarian, classical liberal theory says, well, at that point, you're free to find another deal. Who else is there? These kinds of services are sort of captured by one seller, typically, usually regional. So it's like in the Northeast, it's, AT&T over there. It's Fios, whatever, right? Verizon. But the point is that's all there is. They have the infrastructure, and so they get to tell you. So the only way to overcome things like this is through consumer cooperatives and government regulation.
Yeah.
And that means just pooling the power of people like you together through these kind of representative bodies, whether it's the labor union, the consumer co-op, et cetera, to push back against the technical sort of economist term is countervailing power of the many against the few.
Absolutely.
If you pool the power of the many, suddenly they can go up against the few.
Well, look what Nigel Farage has done about the banking problem in the UK. I mean, one man with a platform and a website, and all of a sudden it's an issue, and the Conservative government, which was sitting around letting this happen, the debanking, is now freaked out and passing regulations and humiliating these guys. I believe very strongly that websites run by consumers and citizens, where we're cataloging all this stuff, will end up having power. They rely, I think, right now on the fact that we are divided, that we do not exist really in community situations anymore. Church is kind of over. And all this happened because of COVID for people too. AA meetings were closed. Nobody was getting together for anything. So they kind of rely on us being isolated. And I think the website, it sounds like such a kind of a primitive response, but I want a list of all the companies that are hiring Dylan Mulvaney. I want to know to not give them my money. I don't give money to companies like Maybelline mascara, who have a man in a beard putting mascara on the lady in their ads. Like, I don't want that. And I want to know who's doing that. And I think if we can do what the left does so well, they are the boycott kings and queens, aren't they? They take out news anchors and products all the time. And we've never really done that, I think, because maybe we actually are kinder. I do actually believe that now, but we are kinder and reluctant to do it. But
no, the boycott is one of the classic, as my friend the political economist Michael Lind says the boycott is one of the classic weapons of the weak. They call it, right? So it's the labor union is one, the boycott is the other, and then civil disobedience, as he argued. I would just say that it's only one, and there are others where boycott doesn't necessarily work because you're not necessarily dealing, for example, with an ideological cable company that's like pushing weird ideology, although in some ways it is, depending on programming. But the point is that like there, the issue is much more of a kind of old-fashioned issue of oligopoly or monopolistic power, and the answer to it is, either is largely regulatory. And so, and here's where I disagree with a lot of my fellow conservatives is this tendency to just say, all regulation is bad. And so what you end up doing is regulation goes on, but either it's privatized regulation over which you have no say, and so you're left powerless, or, it's your ideological enemies who recognize that a complex economy needs regulation. They're the ones who kind of occupy the commanding heights and then pass on the regulation. So I think the healthier conservative attitude, and here I know I'm sort of a minority on the right, but I'm beginning to make headway, I think, is to say, regulate in a complex society, regulation is inevitable. Yeah. There's like government regulation, but the way that, like, for example, your speech is regulated by a few Silicon Valley oligarchs on their social media platforms, that's a form of regulation too. Yeah. Right? It's a kind of pseudo law that nevertheless, matters a lot. If you say the wrong thing about COVID, or if you did in the years 2020 to 2022, they could unperson you, and that has all sorts of social ramifications for you. So, and whether or not free speech really lived or died in that era, it mattered on those platforms. Like, you could individually go out into the street corner and say, I disagree with lockdowns. And maybe like 2-3 people would sympathetically see you. But if you wanted to get your message out, it was on these privately owned platforms where you were subject to regulations over which you had no democratic say or any kind of accountability that you could demand from the other side. So regulation is inevitable in a complex economy. The only question is whether or not the ordinary people have a say over it, or whether it's, the sole preserve of a few powerful people, whatever the ideology might be. Typically right now it's this kind of woke COVIDian ideology. Could be some other ideology in the future, but the way to counteract that is to just say, we need regulation. It's got to be more democratic, more subject to the will of the people, and less sort of elusive from our grasp.
Well, what's interesting about what you just said is that it does that very thing highlights the two sides of how we live right now. So the COVIDian people who were all in for vaccines, all in for lockdowns, all in for school closures, masks, the whole 9 yards, right? They loved being regulated that way. They absolutely loved it. But I would argue that the regulation actually, because that regulation came from my perspective, and I know I'm right, without backup data. That the science, there was no consensus about what they were doing whatsoever. And they were running from that through their censorious behavior too. They were trying to hide that. But where I am kind of full on about regulations is in, let's say, the case of Boeing and those 3 jets that crashed, all for the same problem. And I still can't figure out why somebody didn't go to jail over it, because it was about the way they had designed this autopilot that was crashing the plane, and they didn't think they needed to include instructions on how to train the pilots to fix it. It took 3 crashes for anybody to really pay attention to what was happening. And I thought, wow, like what is wrong with the FAA? So I can be pretty, as a former lefty journo, that's the kind of regulatory stuff I love, that planes are not supposed to crash because Boeing was behaving irresponsibly. And the whole weight of the world should fall on those men and women who let that happen. And I think some should probably be in jail over it, actually. So I can really sing for that. But regulation on the other side, like around COVID, was so not fact-based and so almost arbitrary that I kind of see a divide in between those things. And I don't know philosophically how you put it's clear for me to see. I can see exactly how to do it, but I'm not sure that message is arguable in today's kind of Instagram worthy political climate, where people can absorb complicated ideas like that, contradictory ideas like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I mean, I think that you briefly brought up the banking case, the debanking case, which has been one of the most terrifying forms of this kind of behavior. And it's really, really unfortunate that people on the left, which traditionally, it's like suspicion of banking, arbitrary power of bankers was supposed to be, at the center of progressive concern back in the day.
The man, but now, that banker was the man, right?
He was the emblematic figure of the man, was the banker. And now, because this power is being wielded for ideological ends that some progressives approve of, too many of them are poo-pooing and say, oh, well, okay, Farage is a crank. Who cares? Like, it's fine. Well, don't you think this could happen to you if in 10 years from now, the ideological formations might be different.
Yeah.
And this kind of power could be used against you who want to do this, that, and the other on climate change or the economy or so forth. This power could be used against you. So you should be really careful about that. And again, I actually wrote an essay for this interesting website called Unheard.
Yes, love them.
HERD. I wrote an essay for them about the debanking of Nigel Farage as an instance of Tyranny Inc., of the sort of the thesis of my book. It's been going on for a long time. Actually, the first serious use of it was in the aftermath of January 6th, when these online crowdfunding sites like PayPal, payment processing sites like PayPal, began to block fundraisers for the January 6th defendants. Whatever you think of those, that's a really sinister use of power, because you block people from being able to send money to each other. And then in Canada, it was deployed against the trucking protesters, against the vaccine mandate. They were totally debanked, Again, then it was used in the Netherlands against farmers fed up with, and now here, purely based on Nigel Farage's opinions, right? He supports Brexit. They disagree with Brexit, or he thinks we should give less aid to Ukraine, more aid. It doesn't matter. But just based on his viewpoints, he was debanked by Coutts, his bank, this really powerful institution in Britain. But you saw, I mean, someone with a platform, as you said,
he's winning.
He's winning. He shed a spotlight on it, and hopefully he will drag the Tories, the supposedly conservative government of Britain, kicking and screaming. He will drag them into, the answer to this is to just have a democratic response to the power of bankers to debank you. We have to know what criteria they use. Those criteria should be democratically accountable. They should not be ideological criteria. What you believe, shouldn't be the basis on which you lose access to banking. By the way, again, here, we have a good kind of potential bipartisan consensus on this, if we can get there. We have in the United States and in England as well, because it's a common law doctrine called the common carrier doctrine. And what the common carrier doctrine, which is very old, says is basically that, services that are just supposed to be available to everyone can't discriminate against you in unreasonable fashion. So, the common carrier doctrine actually affects you as a traveler on an airplane or on a railroad, or your telephone company is subject to it. Your telephone company can't, boot you from their service because of the words that you say on your telephone call, And so that's called the common carrier doctrine. And we need to extend that, to things like banking. We need to extend that certainly to social media, as actually, of all people, that radical Marxist, Clarence Thomas has suggested that we should use the common carrier doctrine with respect to places like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. So, again, it's like there are all these resources in the Western tradition, in the American tradition, to solve some of these issues. It just means kind of leaving behind some of this libertarian dogmatism that says the market always knows best. No, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it can be really, really abusive, and our tradition has been prepared in the past to recognize that and to try to ameliorate the problem.
Well, and human beings need to be reined in. They can't be, right?
Wherever they stand.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I just on the debanking for a minute. I mean, I had my doubts about the seriousness of what they said in the report. And then when I heard Mr. Farage talking about it and reading from it, I thought, this was written by a 16-year-old social justice warrior. I mean, an idiot. It was not serious. And I think their massive dossier was a few articles from the Guardian newspaper, which is notoriously left-wing and hating of Brexiteers. I mean, it was like a high school project for me. And the fact that Coutts Bank, the Queen's Bank, the King's Bank, would participate in something like that, that was almost more scary to me than the debanking itself, that there is a group of people in that Coutts building sitting around saying dumb stuff like that about people, right?
Yes, but unfortunately lots of people say dumb things like on the internet and or whatever. They're sitting at a bar and they say, they brainstorm silly stuff, except these people have the power to remove you from the banking system.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, you and I might brainstorm this or that and nothing comes of it. And maybe that's for all for the good. But, here you have people who have the power to socially unperson you, because if you can't engage in the medium of this exchange in money, you're sort of unpersoned. And
I believe that there is a reason for it beyond the immediate debanking of someone. And that is that all of these things that you mentioned, the January 6th people, the truckers, our beloved truckers, the people who sent money to the truckers, Nigel Farage and others, it does land on your nervous system in a certain way if you are on kind of our side of much of the cultural debate, right? Mm-hmm. And I had a thought. I thought, wow, I tweet and Substack a lot about trans extremism, which is a real no-no, apparently. There were people in England debanked.
Absolutely.
It was like a vicar who said the mildest thing. And it turned out that the person at the bank, it was one of those, they're called them building societies, which I believe are like credit unions in the UK, right? And the person who did the debanking decision of this, who had said a mild thing, he's entitled to think that mild thing, debanked him. She was a trans woman. And she had been on the board of Mermaids, this really extreme trans and kids charity organization. So it
really is extreme.
Oh, and that's who the banks are bringing in to make these decisions. Really? It really makes you, I now believe that human resources is the devil that is oppressing us all right now. I think it's one of the worst things going, but I was making another point. It was just that these things do affect one's nervous system because you begin looking over your digital shoulder from time to time.
It's terrifying. Yeah.
Right.
And again, go back to my point was, whatever your view on these cultural issues are, wherever you come down, I happen to be, with you, Trish, on the gender issues, but whatever your views are, you should just be really alert to and alarmed by the idea that any individual has the power to make these decisions without you having any sort of public democratic recourse to losing access to banking or losing access to your social media profile, being censored, etc.
Right.
It is really unfortunate. I think that the modern progressive movement, in part because it thinks it's winning these issues, at the level of these institutions, has lost sight of this older tendency of the older left, which I really respect. And I'm talking about people like, Ralph Nader.
Yeah,
and,
me too.
the sort of, and I actually do think, to be honest.
And Bernie before he went crazy.
Absolutely,
Bernie.
Yeah. Absolutely, Bernie.
And who is the guy running, the African-American guy?
Cornel West is another.
I worship Cornel West. I do.
is another good example of this.
Yeah.
And, to be honest, here's where now I've been punching left, now to punch right, is that when those people were active and were were sounding some of these warnings, people like Nader and Bernie Sanders, etc., it was people on the right, including myself. I used to be a much more conventional, I used to work at the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is like the bastion of, free market, Uber Alles kind of ideology.
Yeah.
I would sort of dismiss these people. And, in a way, their prophecies came through about the danger of overweening private power. I really think we should sort of go back to that if possible. And there is a possibility of, it's not a possibility, it's sort of taking shape of an alliance between more populist right-wingers, especially as the Republican Party, and likewise in some ways the Tories in Britain become more and more the party of working class, lower middle class people. An alliance between them and the old left, what still remains on the old left.
Yeah.
And it's possible. So, for example, on the gender issues that you mentioned, now we're going away from private power. But, in Britain, a lot of the opposition or resistance to this has come from like old school feminists who are like, no, being a woman is not just what you subjectively think in your head. It's actually a physical, biological thing that is immutable in some ways. You're born it. You have the sort of chromosomes, and that biological sexual difference is meaningful. It can't just be erased. And of course, there are lots of people who are traditional believers, Jews, Christians, etc., who, for their own reasons, insist on the same thing. So. And so I think on these economic issues too, there is a possibility. There are lawmakers on the right, like Senator Marco Rubio, of all people, has become very good on some of the sort of issues of corporate power. JD Vance, etc.
I love JD. He's great.
And they JD is now partnering with Liz Warren on banking executives. On issue of banking power. So just so we're not all doom and gloom, the popular response to this can potentially bear fruit.
Well, I hope so. That's interesting about JD and Elizabeth Warren, because I sort of was digging Elizabeth Warren like in about 2014 when she was trying to organize so that the banking industry wasn't running amok. But she said so many hideous things on culture issues that I just can't.
I know. This is so difficult for some of us where I'm like, oh man, like on economics, I could really sign up to Bernie.
Yeah.
But, on the culture stuff, he's so doctrinaire. He's sort of indistinguishable. And another one, I think where Bernie made a mistake is on, which is a different issue. We shouldn't probably get into it. But on immigration too, the labor movement had historically always been against open borders. And so in 2015-16, when Bernie was asked, what do you think of open borders? He said, that's a Koch brothers idea. Of course, I don't like it. Yeah. And now he's sort of been disciplined into... Yeah. Kind of walking the party line there.
No, but we're all wondering what the hell happened. So it is interesting to talk about it. Like for me, Bernie, I was pretty kind of addicted to Bernie when he was running. And because I had a wrong idea to some degree about who he was. His capitulation to Hillary Clinton was one of the most traumatic political events of my life. And I'm not even American. But, I was watching him being abused by the DNC. Of course, there were the emails showing that they were even rigging the primary. Debbie Wasserman Schultz got fired over it against Bernie, and he never spoke up. Like he just played the game instead of being honest about it. And then, at that convention, which was one of the worst things, the first thing that happened was that Robbie Mook unpacked the first charges of Russia collusion just before that convention to get people not thinking about those very, very damaging emails. And then Bernie capitulated to the Clinton machine. And I'll never forget the faces of those really optimistic young people weeping over the betrayal of what he did, right? And that was kind of it for me. That was a big watershed moment. I thought, wow. My intuition about what's happening on the left. I was reading a lot of Thomas Frank, Listen Liberal and What's the Matter with Kansas and stuff. And I thought, well, I'm done with these people, And then the Russia collusion thing, I was really done with them because I thought at least let this guy have a chance to govern. He's anti-war. He's not bad on some economic policy. He's really good on trade. Let him have a turn, and that was when it was over because I knew the media was lying about it. So that was a big thing in my life, a driving force. Before we go, I want to talk to you a little bit, if you don't mind. It's very personal, but I think a lot of my listeners are struggling. I converted to Catholicism quite enthusiastically, as we said before we rolled, and was very, very downtrodden by, and have been downtrodden about the Pope recently and some of his positions, and even, the Anglican, what's his name, Welby, the Anglican Church person. How do you square some of these uber, seemingly liberal policies being espoused in a church that's already really struggling with some pretty big issues of morality? Like, I'm just wondering, what do you flinch? Do you get upset? What do you tell yourself in order to not be distanced from something that you really want and need to have in your life?
Yeah, so it's interesting. When I was first received into the church, which was in 2016. I already had a kind of public profile. I was working for the Wall Street Journal then, as I mentioned, and on the opinion page. And my immediate temptation was to sort of throw myself into these ecclesiastical controversies, these disputes between the Pope and various cardinals, the Pope being typically framed as being on the left and the cardinals on the right or whatever. And they have these sort of... And so for the first year or so, I was a very kind of quote unquote public Catholic that way, where I would be like commenting on this stuff. And then as time has gone on, to be honest, I realize it's partly just above my pay grade, that theology is very complicated business.
Yeah,
and
interesting.
And so I try to relate to the church the way most Catholics had for, until relatively recently. Most Catholics didn't even know who was Pope, because the news from, whoever was elected, listening about the Avignon papacy, where, in the 14th century, the papacy was briefly relocated to Avignon, France, from Rome. When one of the Avignon popes got elected, it would take so long for the news to reach, Catholics, Christians, I say Catholics back then, and everyone was Catholic, in 13th century, 14th century England. Yeah. You wouldn't even know what the heck is going on. And I think that's kind of healthy for me personally, is to not look too close at how the sausage is made. I'm sure there were lots of ugly scenes if you looked at the medieval church, if you saw it up close. But I have this faith that, this institution was divinely ordained, that that St. Peter and his successors were handed the keys by the Son of God, with the power to bind and loose on earth, et cetera, et cetera. And so, ultimately, I think the church will be okay in the most kind of eschatological long-term sense. Everything's going to be fine, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against her. So, I just try not to get into it too much. And the other thing I would say is, insofar as I do look into it, I have to say that, this papacy has felt disruptive to a lot of Catholics. But if you look at the level of doctrine, nothing has changed.
Yeah.
In other words,
well, Latin Mass, right? What about Latin Mass? Isn't that a big hoo-ha right now?
So that's not a doctrinal change. In other words, it doesn't have to do with what Catholics, believe about, I don't know, like sex, gender, morality, etc. It's just it's a kind of a liturgical change, which, the Second Vatican Council reformed the liturgy, and in some places that reform went way too far. And, the idea that the older Mass could just be sort of abrogated was offensive to a lot of people. But anyway, it's not an issue of doctrine. It's not like the church has changed what we believe about, like, God the Father or the Trinity or who Jesus was, etc., or ethics or morality. I mean, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is still the definitive statement of what the Church believes on basically everything, in a beautiful, elegant summary.
Yeah.
And none of that has been fundamentally altered. So that's basically safe. A lot of times Pope Francis will say things that I think his conservative critics don't give him enough credit for. So, for example, he's compared abortion to sort of Nazi practices. He's described gender ideology as demonic or satanic. Yeah. He says this stuff, but then, he has his style where he wants to, reach out to people who he thinks are marginalized. And so he'll say, you're loved, you're accepted. Doesn't necessarily mean that, like, your lifestyle shouldn't change, etc. But I do think that we're called as Catholics, and there are people, I know there are listeners that aren't Catholics, so this doesn't really apply to them, but as Catholics, you have to sort of try to approach church authority with a degree of docility. You know, the sort of like, you know, he is the Holy Father, you know, and so I should have this attitude of, if he says something, you know, examine it in my own conscience and see, etc., but not to have this immediately oppositional attitude that it's especially prominent in the Anglo-American world, where like the Pope says something and people are like, oh no, attacking, you know.
I'm sort of like that. I get, but
it is an American, I think, and I'm an immigrant in some ways, but it's a very Anglo tradition, and in some ways it has very healthy kind of you know, it's healthy in our political community that, you know, we have this democratic culture, and if someone says something, there has to be an opposition to it. We'll debate everything, but we just have to recognize that the church is not a democracy. You know, it was put forth as a monarchy. That you know, some of the titles of the Pope is that he's the vicar of Christ on earth, etc. And more important, I mean, beyond that seems like authority worship. What I mean is we should try to avoid bringing into church life, and this applies, I think, to people of faith, of any faith, is to not bring the same left-right dynamics, partisan dynamics, into church life as much as possible.
Totally.
We should try to avoid that. Yeah.
Well, you know, it's typical of me to convert to a religion and then start criticizing it. I mean,
like I said, I was like that. Then I just was like, oh man, I you know, when you get into any of the details about like footnote 8 in this or that encyclical, and you realize the sort of complexity of moral theology, you're like, ooh, I'm just a journalist.
Yeah, right? I know. And look, at the thing that is always steadfast about the Catholic Church is that they have the best architecture and really great art. So
enjoy that.
Yeah. I guess for me too, part of it was just, I felt let down a bit by some of these institutions during COVID. I didn't know where to get what I needed. And I should have been more internal about it, but I just felt, wow, like when is the cavalry coming to save us?
No, I mean, I'm happy to share that frustration with you that, for example, most of the bishops, not all of them, but most of the American bishops were way too quick to shut down churches and to give up to essentially concede that church is non-essential.
Right.
When in fact, you know, they're supposed to believe that church is the most essential thing.
Yes.
And so, you know, I absolutely share that.
I wish they'd said, okay, flock, everybody who's had COVID and has antibodies can now go and volunteer in long-term care. Wouldn't that have been a wonderful thing to do? But nobody was thinking that way. And so we're kind of stuck with the fallout from that. But okay, so your book, it's on sale like any minute now, right? Is it?
Yeah, it can be pre-ordered right now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You know, we just bashed Amazon for half the show. I'm telling you. But, you know, every place where books are sold, and it'll be out on August 15th.
Okay, it's great. It's a brilliant book. I didn't get through the whole thing, but I did some major dip-ins in the last 24 hours. And it's fantastic. It's a really, really interesting way of sort of looking at capitalism now and the markets now. It's called Tyranny Inc. And are you the senior editor of Compact Magazine or the executive?
No, I'm one of the founding editors.
One of the founding editors. Okay. And you've had a huge career in media too. You're a big deal. So, and you were there when the Hunter Biden laptop story broke. So I'll talk to you about that on another show.
I'm happy to come back.
Dying to know the details. Okay. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. I would say, people, in the spirit of the testimonies we've been hearing from Canadians who are struggling or leaving or trying to figure out how to make it work, that this brilliant song by Oliver Anthony, Rich Men North of Richmond, which I played last week and the week before, I'm playing it again this week too, because I can, and I think it's important, captures some of that sentiment. And like last week, you're going to hear the audio of the song with some reactions of people as they're seeing the song for the first time. As I said, it's a big moment because it's telling us that we are all together against the people at the top, right? Let's stop fighting. It's not about who's black, who's white, who's Asian, who's not, whatever. It's none of that. None of that's real. None of it's real. What's real is that we are in a struggle against elites who are plundering the world right now under the guise of COVID, under the guise now of climate change, whole bunch of bad stuff going on, and everybody's getting poorer and they're getting richer by a mile. So in keeping with that sentiment, here is Oliver Anthony with this kind of jazzed up version of Rich Men North of Richmond, which was edited by my friend Matt Orfalea. I'll see you back in Toronto. Yuck! Really soon. Stay critical.
I've been selling my soul, working all day, overtime hours for bullshit pay, so I can sit out here and waste my life away, drag back home and drown my troubles away. It's a damn shame what the world's gotten to for people like me, people like you. Wish I could just wake up and it not be true, but it is. Oh, it is living in the new world with an whole soul.
I can rock with that.
These rich men north of Richmond, Lord knows they all just wanna have total control. Wanna know what you think, wanna know what you do, and they don't think you know, but I know that you do, 'cause your dollar ain't shit, and it's taxed to no end.
Okay.
The rich men, the rich men.
Oh, this is true. Tell 'em, buddy.
Some of us can't say what we absolutely know is true, and he's articulating.
I wish politicians would look out for minors, and not just minors on an island somewhere. Lord, we got folks in the street, ain't got nothing to eat, and the obese milking welfare. Well, God, if you're 5'3" and you're 300 pounds, taxes ought not to pay for your bags of fudge rounds. Young men are putting themselves 6 feet in the ground, 'cause all this damn country does is keep on kicking them down. Lord, it's a damn shame what the world's gotten to for people like me.
What?
People like you. Wish I could just wake up and it not be true, but it is. Oh, it is living in the new world with an whole soul. These rich men north of Richmond, Lord knows they all just wanna have total control. Wanna know what you think, wanna know what you do, and they don't think you know, but I know that you do, 'cause your dollar ain't shit, and it's taxed to no end, 'cause the rich men north of Richmond. I've been selling my soul, working all day, overtime hours for bullshit pay.
Damn.
Damn.
Oh my God! Oliver, Anthony.
Rich men north of Richmond.